Hi guys, this week we're concentrating on living true, and the component of the success path that we are focusing on improving is being the bigger person. And many of us have heard about the notion of being the bigger person, but what does this really mean? Well, it definitely doesn't mean eating more. Put simply, being the bigger person simply means to live and interact in the world in a way which better allows us to get along with each other, in a way which results in more peaceful, more rewarding, and more meaningful relationships in our life. And so this is why it is so important to be the bigger person in life, because if you are not, then chances are that you are experiencing conflict within your relationships to some degree. Just think about how many families and friends do you know whom are free of conflict of some sort? Be it the royals, celebrities, your own family or friends, or anyone else. Most are riddled with drama. Whether it's a sibling not talking to a parent, this friend not talking to that friend, that partner, not talking to their ex despite having kids together, work colleagues not getting along or talking with their fellow colleagues, or anything else. The fact that there are so many lonely people within families is a real tragedy. And apart from the damage that this does to relationships, the stress of these interactions can literally suck the energy out of you and rob you of joy in each and every moment. And this is true regardless of the fact that it may have been in the past. If you try to not think about it, or even if you no longer see the person anymore, in other words, you've removed yourself from the situation. In this way, it is important that you strive to be the bigger person, because doing so allows you to live more in the now and enjoy life, which equates to a healthier, happier, and fitter you. It's simple. The more we get along, the less stressed we are. And so, as you can see, being the bigger person does have an effect on your health and well-being in a myriad of ways, in particular by reducing your stress. Now that you know what being the bigger person is and why it's so very important, I want to talk about some of the ways in which we can ensure that we are being the bigger person in our own lives. I suppose at its core, being the bigger person is largely about compassion and understanding. And there are lots of ways we can do this, but here are a few of the key ones. The first one is act. Don't. Act, don't react. Now, we all have things which we react to, and the key here is to know what pushes your buttons, or in more technical terms, what your emotional triggers are. This could be a particular situation, someone's behavior or tone of voice, or both the subtle or explicit things that someone else does which can cause you to react, usually outwardly by exploding, or sometimes inwardly too by completely shutting down. So if you can relate to this, then who or what situations pushes your buttons? The fact that we are often so sensitive to the things that actually push our buttons, and consistently so, is a good clue that the source of what we are feeling isn't about right now, but rather has roots to emotional wounds from our past. So it's important to identify what are things that push your buttons actually remind you of, as well as how this makes you feel within. Then, if possible, You want to have a conversation with whoever is pushing your buttons, in other words, your triggers, as well as the underlying reactions. And I suppose being upfront about what really bothers you is a much better strategy than biting your tongue and trying to sweep it under the rug, as this will only back up on you. You want to do this for two main reasons. The first is obvious, and that is to do your best to stop pushing each other's buttons and getting into arguments in the first place. Now, the second reason is because talking about it allows you to begin healing whatever it is driving the way you feel. Obviously, it's not about the other person doing the heavy lifting here. You also want to step up and actively work to heal these old wounds on your own accord. And there are two ways that you can do this. The first is about getting closure. And to do so, you need to write a letter that you're not going to mail to the parent, ex-partner, or whoever you see as the source, but rather for yourself. And in it, you get off your chest how you felt, what bothered you most. Then you take the time to write a second letter, this time back to yourself. What ideally you would want to hear the other person say if they got your letter, that they are sorry, that they didn't realize how you felt, that they take responsibility for not being more sensitive. And this is about helping you separate the past from the present. Next, you want to work on the present. And this is about rewiring your brain. Here, you need to learn to catch yourself when you do get triggered, rather than getting all fired up when you see those towels on the floor, or whenever whatever attitude presents itself. Instead, work hard to stop that automatic response. And you can do this by stepping back and taking a few deep breaths whilst trying to remain calm. This will prevent your actions following any undesirable thoughts in your head, such as exploding out. Next, talk yourself off the ledge by reminding yourself of why it is you're feeling this way, the way that you do, because it pertains to the past and has little to do with what is going on right here, right now. Remind yourself that this is not a big deal, that he or she is not my ex, my parents, or anyone else, and that they are not out to get me, or whatever it is that you're feeling when you get your buttons pushed. In fact, you can say to yourself whatever you need to say to get out of your emotional brain and back into your reality-based rational brain. Will you automatically feel serene and chilled? No, and probably not for the first few hundred times you do this. But eventually you will replace those old brain circuits with new ones. Neuroplasticity is what it's called. It will get easier, so hang in there. We've all got emotional triggers and they can be, a bear to shake, but you can heal those wounds, put the past to rest, and rewire your brain. Another important consideration ensuring that we act rather than react is to ensure that we don't personalize things, which is really, really easy to do. Taking things personally can happen in two main ways. The first way is where you take your disappointments and struggles personally. And so the first step here is to have a think about what things you might often personalize and, as a consequence, get hurt and upset from. Once you've done that, then it's important to practice becoming mindful of your tendency to blame yourself when things don't go as you wish or as you planned. And you can do this by asking yourself if your response is a rational and reasonable one. When you do this, it's hard to escape the conclusion that blaming yourself for disappointments and struggles makes no sense. They're an inevitable part of the human experience. And practicing this mindful awareness will help you to replace self-blame with self-compassion. Let's face it, life is hard sometimes. You make it harder when you take the bumps in the road personally. It's also important to recognize that you often don't know why people act the way they do. Therefore, to take their behavior personally isn't fair or kind to yourself either. I suppose at the end of the day, the reality is that when you know and live true to who you are, then very little of what people say or do actually affects you at all. It's like water off a duck's back. Another essential aspect of being the bigger person is forgiveness. And whilst I won't get into the detail here now, what I would like to remind you of is the reason to forgive has nothing to do with the other person, but rather is always for your own sake. And you can't get the last 24 hours back, let alone the last 10 years. So never ever hold on to grudges. Simply say to the people in your life what you need to, because otherwise it may be too late. Never would off, could off, should off. Instead, forgive them and just let it go. Forgiving another person doesn't mean you need to be their friend. You may still dislike them, and that's completely okay. But what I will say is often the hardest person to forgive in life is ourselves. If you have done something to hurt another person or done anything which you are remorseful for, then stop wasting energy trying to cover your mistakes and instead acknowledge your wrongs and own it. No one expects you to be perfect. I'm not perfect. No one is. And finally, the last aspect of being the bigger person that I would like to touch on is don't judge. And I say this because sometimes we are quick to judge others because we focus on what makes us different, including things like our body, our job, our age, our wealth, our education, our opinions, or anything else. When instead, we should focus on what makes us similar, like the fact that we all have two eyes, one heart, and we all came from and will eventually return back to the same place when we pass over. As we do this, then those small differences become something to be celebrated rather than frowned upon. In fact, it's what makes the world so interesting. Namaste is a Sanskrit word which roughly translates to the God in me sees the God in you. My question to you is, can you look at others and see the God in them? And can you love them the way that God loves you? Another way we can be less judgmental is to remember that everyone you meet is fighting a battle that you know nothing about. In fact, we are all suffering, some just more so than others. There is always more than meets the eye because everyone has a story, so never judge and assume anything about anyone. Often, the person we judge the most, once again, is ourselves. And most of the time, we don't even realize that we are doing it. So be mindful of negative self-talk and stop being so hard on yourself. As long as you are doing your best in everything that you do, you can't do more than that. And so, in conclusion, if you like, I'd just like to remind you that we never have any control of how, someone else will, what someone else will say or how they'll act, because we all have the free choice to choose that for ourselves. But what we can control is how we react to them or the situation at hand. And while it's essential that we act rather than react, that we don't personalize things, that we forgive, and that we don't judge, what is not acceptable is that we ever allow ourselves to be treated without the respect and dignity that we deserve, including putting up with any abuse, be it physical, verbal, emotional, or anything else. I say that because life is already hard enough without having people to make it harder for us. It really is. And so if you have people in your life who, after having a conversation with them, are still making your life harder than it should be, then it may be time to simply remove, or at a minimum, distance yourself from their life and set up personal boundaries so that this doesn't happen again. Because at some point, they need to take responsibility for their own actions, as well as the repercussions of those actions in their life, okay? Remember, being the bigger person is not about doing the easy thing, it's about doing the right thing. The key is to be intentional about being so, to choose to have peace and harmonious relationships in your life instead of all the drama. And remember, the less drama we have in our lives, the less stress we have too. And that correlates to a healthier and happier you. So, are you always the bigger person?
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to learn more about the other essential attributes of staying in your best shape. And until next time, watch what you chew, do what you need to do, and always live true.